focus with Ejaz here, though. Australia has got into another war of words with China. Peter Dutton, the Defence Minister and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison's cabinet, said to Australian Broadcasting Corporation that conflict with Beijing over Taiwan should not be discounted. Should not be discounted. Those are his words. In the interview, he also suggested the Chinese lease on the port of Darwin could be terminated. Dutton's statement begot a sharp response from Wang Wenbin, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. Wang said, "It is hoped that the Australian side will fully recognize the high sensitivity of the Taiwan issue, abide by the One China principle, be prudent in words and deeds, refrain from sending any false signals to the separatist forces of Taiwan independence, and do more things to benefit the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait and Sino-Australian relations," unquote. Relations between China and Australia have been deteriorating after Huawei Technologies was banned from the country's 5G network, and Canberra called for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. China is sanctioned and slapped high tariffs on a range of Australian exports to China, following Australian Prime Minister Morrison's demand for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Let's get to our discussion of Sino-Australia tensions. This evening, I'm joined by Cheng Xizhong, visiting professor at Southwest University of Political Science and Law and former senior colonel in the PLA who served as a military diplomat in South Asia. With him is Professor Joseph Anthony Camilleri, Emeritus Professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Professor Camilleri here. Professor Camilleri, there's the issue of, obviously, Australia's alliance with the United States. We know how Sino-US relations are shaping up. So there is the issue of alliance and security. So Australia has always bandwagoned with the United States. But there's also the issue of Australian trade with China. Imports and exports combined comes to about $58 billion, while the Australian trade with the United States is kind of a distant second with about $24 billion. So the issue here is the choice between perceived or real security and prosperity. So give me your sense of which side the Australian foreign policy is likely to fall.
Well, I think this is going to be one of the very, very difficult issues confronting Australia. And unfortunately, our government is not managing the relationship with China particularly well. I think that there are very powerful pressures now bearing upon the government, which come from within the government party. They come from a number of government departments and agencies. And of course, they come from the United States, as well as a number of think tanks, which unfortunately are, if you like, addicted to what I call a Cold War mentality. So the present government is, I think, giving in to those pressures, internal and external, and unfortunately doesn't know how to retrieve the relationship with China at this time, which is most unfortunate, even though there are a number of businesses in both the agricultural sector and other sectors which have been damaged by the deterioration in the trade relationship between the two countries. So it's not a very pleasant situation. And unfortunately, the media, by and large, the mainstream and shall I put it mildly, the conservative media in this country are not helping by themselves being party to a good deal of China bashing. So all this is rather unfortunate. None of this is, of course, to say that Australia must agree with everything that China says or does, either within the country or, for that matter, externally. But having differences of view is one thing, and engaging in this unnecessary hostile rhetoric is quite another.
That's a great explainer as an opening, Professor. Now, let me say in November 2019, Channel 9 aired a report alleging that China was trying to infiltrate the Australian Parliament. This report, as you know, was picked up by other wire services like the Associated Press. It got to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and the spokesman rejected the report and the inquiry, saying some Australian politicians, institutions, and media outlets had reached, and those were the words of the Chinese spokesperson, reached a state of hysteria and extreme nervousness. Then, of course, there was the issue of Scott Morrison saying that Australia had suspended the extradition treaty with Hong Kong and spoke out loud about the rights situation in Hong Kong. So there have been a number of issues here. You remember that the Chinese actually gave Channel 9 a list of reasons for Beijing sanctions against Australian exports. You're talking about those in your opening statement, some of the farm exports. For instance, the abattoirs, literally shutting down barley and the wine and so on and so forth. So give me, and you've also talked about how the conservative media and the politicians are basically ratcheting up this rhetoric. Now, given where Australia is situated, that's not a neighborhood that it can change. Are there any possibilities of somehow bringing down this rhetoric and working out some kind of a modus vivendi with Beijing?
There is, but it's going to take some doing. I should explain that there are, of course, important circles within Australia that are very critical of the current direction of government policy, and that includes many in the universities, in the academic arena more generally, and also in some media. Importantly, a great many in the business sector are quietly, privately, being quite critical of government's handling of the issue. So there are a number of factors. Unfortunately, the political opposition, which is the Labor Party, is not as articulate on this subject as it could be. It is cautioning the government. It is proposing that we should be much more careful in the use of the language we have been using, but it does not, as at this moment, offer a very clear-cut alternative, and that's one of the main problems, I think. Some smaller parties are, but so yes, there are a number of forces at work which would be calling for a more subdued, a more carefully crafted set of policies towards China and, of course, towards the United States. But these have yet to gain the traction that's necessary. It may take a little while, and, of course, things could get worse before they get better.
So let's pull in Senior Colonel Cheng Xizhong. Cheng, you've heard what Professor Camilleri is saying. Now, there are voices in Australia. For instance, the former Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, she urged the Morrison government to avoid tit-for-tat exchanges with Beijing, and she also stressed the economic importance of China for Australia and warned that it would be unwise to unnecessarily offend our largest customer. So there are voices, but the situation seems to be sort of moving in a negative direction. So give us your or the Chinese government's perspective on Sino-Australia relations.
Actually, for the past few decades, I think that the relations between China and Australia have been very close. We have got a very close cooperation, especially in the field of business, economy, and trade. So differences, of course, they can exist, but the important point is that the bottom line should not be touched on the issue of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. These are the very sensitive issues because we do not interfere in internal affairs of other countries, and we are also against interference by other countries in China's internal affairs. So first of all, I would like to point out that the remarks of the Australian Defense Minister have seriously violated China's bottom line, and it is serious interference in China's internal affairs. At this point, the Chinese people feel very sensitive. And the Australian Defense Minister remarks, as well as Australians' recent words and deeds on issues involving China's core interests such as Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, have seriously violated, the bottom line. The bottom line cannot be touched. Especially the Taiwan issue is, purely the China's internal affairs involving China's core interests. So no external forces should intervene. And China, on the issue of unification, China must be unified. And China is bound to be unified. It is a matter of time. And Taiwan mainland in the future, I think, will be unified. So we are willing to do our best. We are willing to do our best for the prospect of peaceful reunification, but will never leave any space for any form of separatist activities for Taiwan independence. It is hoped that the Australian side will fully recognize the high sensitivity of the Taiwan issue, abide the one China principle, be cautious in words and deeds, and not send any wrong signal to the Taiwan independence separatist forces, and do more things conducive to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and the Sino-Australian relations. Thank you.
Okay, so those are the Chinese read very clearly. But Senior Colonel Cheng, let me ask you something with reference, frankly, to Australia's capabilities. I mean, when Peter Dutton talked about the possibility of a conflict, frankly, Australia doesn't have the military capacity to take on China or even to intervene in the Taiwan Strait affairs. So what do you think could possibly have got Peter Dutton to make the remarks that he did? Is it just to sort of, play the U.S. tune or create an atmosphere in international public opinion? What possibly could have motivated him to say what he did?
If really something serious happens, say a conflict, that is between Taiwan and China, that is within China, that's China's internal affairs. So nothing to do with the forces outside. So in my impression of Australia, of course, Australia, I understand, is in a very difficult position. Economically, Australian ties with China very close. I've got some figures, for example, a lot of Chinese students go to Australia to study, then bring a lot of capital and also Chinese talents into Australia. And many Chinese students after graduation, they stay there to make contribution to the local society development and economic development. And the year before last year, 2019, the export from Australia to China was 104 billion US dollars. That is on the top. And China's percentage for Australia's export is 38%. So actually, Australia benefits a lot economically in trade from China. And so Australia now realizes that China is very important in its economy, in its business. At the same time, and Australia tried to seek protection from a big power, from the world power. And I do not understand why Australia feels not safe. And such a piece, such a big continent, sea, its size is almost same as China, a little closely to China. And the population is about 250 million. But in that location, I do not see any threat from outside for Australia. So Australia is trying to seek protection from from the United States. And so whatever the United States does, then Australia will follow. So America makes trouble for China, then Australia follows the suit. That is the problem.
Okay. Right. So we go back to Professor Camilleri here. Professor, there's a bit of a chronology here. I mean, I won't put the same question to you with reference to why Peter Dutton said what he did. Now, earlier this month, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the U.S. was concerned about what he said, aggressive actions against Taiwan, and warned that it would be a serious mistake for anyone to try to change the status quo in the Western Pacific by force. Then you have a joint statement by President Joe Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and both the leaders made the first rather explicit reference to peace and stability in Taiwan Strait for over 50 years. So do you think Peter Dutton is basically what he said? He just had a, ear sort of tuned to these earlier statements by the U.S. and also by Japan?
Well, I think we ought to understand that Dutton is a minister who probably lies, shall I put it simply and crudely, even to the right of the Liberal Party. That is to say, he probably has a more hawkish view on a number of issues, both to do with internal security as well as external security. So he's taking, if you like, a position which I don't think would be universally agreed to even by the Liberal Party, which is the governing party. So we've got to, I think, understand that there are nuances. And it's clear that already some other ministers feel very uncomfortable with the kind of language that he has used. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it is the case that the government as a whole, wittingly or unwittingly, has become engaged in a series of initiatives and statements which really go towards a policy of containment of China, which is, I think, very poorly judged. That is true. That's not to say, of course, that Australia has to agree with, as I said before, with everything that China says or does. I don't happen to accept the official Chinese position that any state in the world can do what it pleases with regard to its situation at home and not at any time be susceptible to criticism. Of course, we criticize, not meaning Australia, but the world, human rights abuses wherever they occur. That's the whole purpose of the United Nations, to monitor situations and to take issue with governments that act at home or abroad in ways that are contrary to peace, human rights, and so on. So yes, we can have that, if you like, concern, not just with China, but of course with other countries, including the United States itself, when it does say things and act in ways which are contrary to peace and human rights and so on. So Australia's position on human rights questions, for example, would be much more credible if we applied the same standards, not just to China, but to a number of other countries, including those we regard as allies or friends, the United States included. But of course, we don't do that. And therefore, the credibility of our position is open to question. And people rightly accuse Australian government of having double standards. So that, I think, is a very legitimate criticism. This is not to say that we should not be concerned about how governments all over the world, including the likes of Myanmar, handle very difficult human rights situations. But that said, that should not put into question a constructive relationship with China. And we should be, and there are lots of voices in Australia that are calling for this, we should be using our good offices together with, let's say, Southeast Asian neighbours, to try and see how we can bring about a greater understanding between the great powers and a lessening of tensions in the Taiwan Straits and in other areas to do with relations in the Asia-Pacific region. That should be Australia's role. It is not doing it at the moment, and many of us are hopeful that it might be possible in the time ahead.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more with you, Professor. Here's the thing: you have the Quad, and one of the members of the Quad is India, and talking about human rights violations. I've not heard Scott Morrison say a word about what's happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir, but of course, I agree with you that you already talked about those double standards. Thank you so much. That was Professor Joseph Anthony Camilleri speaking with us. Let me go back to Senior Colonel Cheng. Senior Colonel Cheng, the professor talked about double standards, but I also want to ask you, and this is something that I have asked my other Chinese interlocutors also. Why doesn't, for instance, forget about Taiwan. Taiwan is a completely different, issue altogether, and one understands China's sensitivity to that. Leave aside Hong Kong also, because there are other complexities involved there. What about Xinjiang? I mean, why can China not open it up to external scrutiny? Is there a reason why China has, sort of closed down the area despite all the criticism?
Actually, in China, in Xinjiang region, there is no problem. The West, American and West, they try to cook this issue and play this issue. I think the main purpose is to stop the development of one Belt and Road development. Because if they can succeed in that area, then we cannot proceed with the development of Silk Road, and Xinjiang and Pakistan closely linked with each other. So we have been doing quite well, both economically, both the and also infrastructure. So they would like they do not want to see the success. And if that area is developed, and as China-Pakistan economic corridor is developed, Xinjiang area, the infrastructure is developed, then we can extend westward, and also extend to Central Asia up to Europe. So that is, strategically very important. So they would like to, stop from the very beginning, and I don't think they can succeed. So Xinjiang cotton,
Okay.
Pakistan cotton, the best in the world.
Okay. I'm also joined by Micheal, who's a political analyst and the founder of the American Institute of Foreign Policy, based in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Ms. Lane, for being on the program. You're, of course, discussing Australian Defense Minister Peter Dutton's statement about Taiwan, that conflict with China should not be discounted. And it seems that, given Australia's capabilities, it can neither intervene in the Taiwanese Strait affairs. It does seem that he was kind of, voicing what Antony Blinken had said earlier and what Joe Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister said earlier. But it has definitely begotten a sharp riposte from the Chinese. So give me your sense of where the Sino-Australian relations are headed. We know that, they have been nosediving over the last 2 years or so.
Certainly at this point, the Sino-Australian relations are quite chilly. It's difficult to imagine them getting much chillier than they already are, although I suppose there's always room for that. I think that's where they're headed, is a continued maintenance of the Chile relationship. There is a great deal of concern among a lot of countries in the region and the United States as its partners about the fairly fast, aggressive expansion of Chinese military power and expansion of strategic power in the area. As these things continue to happen, the President of the United States, President Biden, of course, last month convened the first meeting of the Quad in the virtual meeting, but the first one that featured actual heads of state as they discussed that issue and many others that were important to the region. I think that the the defense minister's comments about we can't discount conflict is not really meant to signify military conflict, although he left that intentionally vague. But I think he's talking about the fact that we are headed for a number of years of a really chilly relationship between the countries of that area that are aligned with Australia and the United States and against the expanding influence in the region of China. And I think he's right. We're headed for some real diplomatic and strategic conflict.
Okay, so here's the thing. Australia has import-exports combined $58 billion US dollars of trade with China. And a lot of Australian prosperity depends on that trade. The Australian trade with the United States is a distant second. It's about $24 billion. So from what you're saying, it seems to me that the choice that Australia is making, despite where it is geographically situated, is to prefer security over prosperity. Is that a good way of looking at it?
It's that dramatic. I think when I talk about increased conflict, I'm talking about measuring it in sort of micro stages rather than macro stages. Of course, the big kahuna, the big trade that China is interested in and that the rest of the world is interested in is the evolving development and deployment of 5G networks. And Huawei, the Chinese company, of course, leads the world in terms of the ability to do that. And under the Trump administration, and now apparently adopted, the Trump philosophy adopted by the Biden administration, is to sort of freeze Huawei out of those opportunities, particularly among Western countries, for any number of reasons, but the most important of which is the idea of security, technical security. You know, what is the ability of these 5G networks to eavesdrop and spy on the countries in which they're deployed. So with Huawei already sort of put aside and that issue being settled as we're not really going to let them in, then we're talking about the rest of the trade. I think Australia would likely be interested in the rest of the trade. China would certainly be interested in the rest of the trade, but what is it about that that allows them to do it? The second key issue coming up, as far as I can see, is what Australia decides to do with the Port of Darwin. That, of course, has a long-term lease to the Chinese to operate that particular port in Australia. There's a lot of discussion in Australia as to whether or not that lease should be terminated. I don't believe any decisions have been made yet, and so we'll have to keep our eye on what Australia does on that particular issue, and that will send us a real signal as to how serious they are in terms of reducing their economic involvement with China in favor of other partners, or if they are really going to let their economic dependence on China rule their decisions and maintain that contract.
Well, I'm happy you talked about the port of Darwin, because Dutton in the same interview had also suggested that Chinese lease on that port could be terminated. But thank you so much. That was Micheal Lane speaking with us. Let me quickly go back to Senior Colonel Cheng here. Senior Colonel Cheng, it seems that Australia is likely to choose security over prosperity. And the only way to go about that is to bandwagon with the United States. It seems to me that the die has been cast as far as that is concerned.
I do not think, let's see the Sino-American relations. And if with the new administration, China-America relations can be a little normal, then I think Australia will be in a more comfortable position. But if the new administration continues with the same policies, the same strategy as the last administration, then it will be very difficult, also very uncomfortable for Australia. And I wish, Australia will be in a balanced position. But economic development, especially under the present situation of coronavirus pneumonia, I think recovery of the economy is important for every country, and including Australia. And China now economy is recovering very fast. In the first quarter of the current year, it is nearly 20% growth. And Australia, I think, can see it if they put more efforts on the so-called security issue. Then I think its economy will not, benefit. If they continue cooperation with China economically, trade, then Australia will get benefit from the Chinese economic recovery. I think the Australian government is very smart. They can balance. Anyway, Australia and America, they are not in equal position. Australia, Japan, South Korea, they are in the same alliance, but they are small brothers of the big boss. So I wish, actually in the whole region, Asia Pacific, I think the main problem is from the world power. If the world power, would like to work for the peace, and then all the countries, including China and Australia and Pakistan, will have peace. And that is the root cause of the problem, as I see.
Well, that's the ideal world, Cheng, because structural realists would say that there is no emerging power or the existing hegemon except peer competition. But thank you so much. That was Senior Colonel and Professor Cheng Xizhong speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the continuing protest and unrest in Myanmar. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Human rights groups and protesters in Myanmar have criticized an agreement between Maung the general who seized power 3 months ago, and ASEAN leaders to end Myanmar's violent political crisis. Critics say the deal falls short of restoring democracy and holding the army to account for killing hundreds of civilians. 748 civilians, including children, have been killed since people in Myanmar began resisting the military coup. According to a statement from Brunei, the current ASEAN chair, the consensus was reached on 5 points: ending violence, constructive dialogue among all parties, acceptance of aid, a special ASEAN envoy to facilitate discussions, and a subsequent visit to Myanmar. The statement did not give a timeline, and it did not mention political prisoners. To discuss the deal and the criticism, I'm joined by Simon Billenness, Executive Director, International Campaign for Rohingya, and Director, No Business with Genocide, based in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Maung Zarni, co-founder, Forces of Renewal Southeast Asia, a cross-border network of pro-democracy scholars and activists. Let me begin with Dr. Zarni here. Dr. Zarni, it seems to me, while ASEAN is, of course, trying to somehow, figure out or ameliorate what's happening in Myanmar, the fact is that this deal seems to give the junta a pass, and as the critics say, it has no timeline, it does not mention political prisoners, it does not mention restoration of democracy, and it certainly does not mention, holding to account the generals who did the coup d'etat.
Yes, you're absolutely right about the points you raised, and no timeline, no accountability, no concrete solution, and I might add, no impact whatsoever. I think there are 2 points that need to be pointed out. One is this Trumpian, all sides, all parties seize violence. That is actually adding insult to the injury of 54 million Burmese people, because there's only one side that has been perpetrating terroristic acts, no less than snipering, slaughtering unarmed peaceful protesters, simply exercising their right to free speech and freedom of expression. And secondly, it is more than a free pass, in fact. Mayor Online yesterday, on the 26th of April, briefed his terrorist state administrative council, spinning his trip to Jakarta as essentially a successful legitimation trip. And they issued a statement in the state media today saying that, the Myanmar junta will only consider accepting, the special envoy to come and quote unquote, mediate or help the restore law and order, only when the Burmese military deemed suitable and appropriate. And so basically it is a complete slap on the face of the entire ASEAN. And what needs to be happening is ASEAN, the rest of the ASEAN, issuing a statement saying that they are considering to suspend this genocidal mass murderers regime from the ranks.
That would have been, possibly could have had some salutary impact. But let me pull in Simon Billenness here. Simon Billenness, we have spoken about this, what's happening, the unfortunate events in Myanmar previously also. And I remember that, you came up with a rather extensive agenda of how the junta could be pressured into conceding the demands of the protesters. But it seems to me that perhaps that optimism was too early, or perhaps a little bit misplaced given the realities on the ground and how the ASEAN have treated this issue.
Well, I think Dr. Zarni's pointed out very correctly that ASEAN failed to put any effective pressure on the Myanmar military. And in fact, by inviting Min Aung Hlaing to Jakarta, they legitimized this military coup when they should have been recognizing as a legitimate government of Myanmar the national unity government that's been established. But, I think what's very clear from the fact that the Myanmar military is already just walking back from even these very feeble commitments that they made at the ASEAN meeting. The fact that they're walking this back now shows that the only thing that the Myanmar military understands is political and economic pressure. And so, ASEAN needs to address not just recognizing the national unity government and delegitimizing the junta politically. They also need to join with the United States, join with the European Union, join with the UK in cutting off the financial flows that sustain the Myanmar military. And we're talking about the money that the military gets from oil and gas companies, from timber, and from gem sales.
Right. I was kind of, struck by these 5 points, especially ending violence and constructive dialogue among all parties, because it doesn't seem to me, even from afar, that the Burmese military is in any mood to have any kind of constructive dialogue with the protesters. But Dr. Zarni, you talked about the suspension of Myanmar's membership from ASEAN. Now, as I said, it would be a great step, but how realistic would it be to think that ASEAN could do that pending restoration of democracy in Myanmar? And I ask this given the rather lame sort of deal that they've worked out, and also, as you said yourself and rightly, that they seem to have legitimized this coup.
ASEAN probably did not think that they legitimized the coup or the leader, because the Malaysian Foreign Ministry and Indonesia, in particular, took pain to make sure that Maung Aung did not come across as one of the ASEAN heads of states. He was specifically identified, as a matter of factly, as the commander-in-chief of the Burmese armed forces, not as an ASEAN leader. But the Maung Aung and his public relations team targeting for internal consumption of the armed forces rank and file. He presented this trip as essentially acceptance of him as one of the ASEAN leaders. And obviously for any astute observer, this is a twisted act on his part. And ASEAN, how realistic can to expect ASEAN to suspend? I think ASEAN operates on the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of member states, and there are 10 of them. But I think this summit, despite all the shortcomings and failings, it actually, and in effect, broke that sacrosanct principle, as pointed out by former Malaysian Foreign Minister Tan Sri Albert yesterday in my conversation on Facebook Live. ASEAN held this summit in Jakarta under the Brunei's chair and with the under the auspices of Indonesian President Jokowi's office, and it already broke the principle of non-interference by holding a summit devoted specifically to Myanmar crisis. And so in fact, ASEAN is taking a rather, difficult reputational damage by keeping this murderous regime among its ranks. And so I think that, the next step should be ASEAN should start exploring the possibility of suspending Myanmar seat, or alternatively, no longer engaging with the Myanmar military and recognizing the national unity government that Simon Billenness rightly brought up. And the fact is, this is an extraordinary situation for which ASEAN is completely unprepared to deal with. The situation is as follows. 54 million Burmese people, including the majority Buddhist Burmese, no longer view the National Armed Forces of Burma, known as Tatmadaw, as a protective national defense force. We see them as nothing short of a fascist, terroristic occupational force. So this is the situation that the Burmese people are prepared not to accept under any circumstances, that the young people are training by the thousands to wage armed revolt. As I speak, there are fightings going on in Chin State across, near India, the Karen and Kachin State, across the borders from China and Thailand. So we have in the middle of Southeast Asia, a Syria-like situation developing, and ASEAN should learn the facts fast and act on its feet. Otherwise, things are going to get, out of control soon, very soon.
Absolutely. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Simon Billenness. Simon Billenness, what Dr. Zarni is saying is something that we perhaps discussed previously on this program, also with reference to some of the rebel groups saying that they will actually jump in the fray on the side of the protesters if the junta does not restore democracy. And now, if, as Dr. Zarni is saying, thousands are training and getting prepared for an armed fight, then we seem to be looking at some kind of civil war.
What I'm saying is the intensity is going to get a lot higher, and even in cities and towns, we are looking at a very asymmetrical civil war. One side, the Tatmadaw, fully armed to teeth, and the protesters and communities resorting to homemade weapons and whatever they can come up with. Sorry to jump into Simon's slot.
Okay, Simon, back to you.
What Dr. Zarni said is entirely correct. The civil war in Burma never ended. There have always been ethnic minorities fighting the Burmese army. It's just that the civil war has intensified now, particularly now that the ethnic minority armies are finding common cause with the Burman majority and are joining forces against the Myanmar military. So, I think really the question here for ASEAN is they need to side with the Myanmar people. They need to make sure that they're not providing any further financial support to this Myanmar army that's completely out of control, and that they side with the Myanmar people in this struggle. And only if that happens will we prevent the kind of civil war that we've seen for a decade in Syria.
I fear, unfortunately, that we probably will be discussing Myanmar again. I say unfortunately because with reference to what's happening. But thank you so much, Simon Billenness. Thank you also to Dr. Maung Zarni for his insights. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And yes, as I always say, COVID-19, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols. Good night and goodbye.